So, yeah, hello, Ian Rainsburgh here, Guidance Software. All familiar faces. Hi, Eamon. A few more in the audience that I know. So, quick show of hands before we get started. Who in the audience has either used or heard of a forensic software application called EnCase? Good, pretty much a majority. For those few hands that did not go up, what EnCase is the tool of choice. So if any of us are unfortunate enough to get caught doing something we shouldn't be doing on our computers by law enforcement or our HR departments, EnCase is typically the tool that is used to do two things. One, what exactly that device has been doing, all the way down from memory to master boot record. And secondly, and arguably the more important fact about why people use EnCase for this stuff, is we are the judicially accepted standard. So, kind of without further ado, I'll whiz straight through into the intro and agenda. So what we're going to cover off, introduction, more or less just done, credentials, so you know why as the writers of EnCase we kind of have the ability to stand here and kind of hopefully impart a few lessons to you guys. Then a bit of and anyone that's heard me speak before, you'll know we go kind of deep on this. So we'll have a bit of a touch upon the age of compromise and why, probably 3-4 years ago, there would have been half the number of people in this room than there are today. So we'll touch upon that. We'll talk about some of the challenges that we see from our kind of our customer base. Then something new for some of you, inside-out security. So this is kind of an endpoint outward as opposed to a network inward kind of approach. I've got one kind of closing slide that basically says everything that you spent with me when I worked at Cisco or F5 or anything you spend with other perimeter vendors. I saw RSA out there, I saw Splunk out there. How you can kind of tie all this stuff together. Defense in depth is kind of really the key. So, let's move forward. Our credentials. So firstly, Gartner put a report out. There's no magic quadrant for something called the EDR space, which is how Gartner, it's the particular box that Gartner puts our world in. So EDR stands for Endpoint Detection and Response. There's no magic quadrant for it because basically it's really quite new. Now, we're not a new firm. We've been doing this since the mid-90s, and hence we're so proud of our kind of number one position, according to Gartner. I mentioned kind of what EnCase gets used for, so I don't need to touch on that. For any of you from larger corporations, the next bit is kind of potentially of interest. Rather than that use case that I just described, where a policeman or a law enforcement officer or somebody in the military takes away my laptop and takes it to a lab and does whatever they're going to do on it and reports back. In the corporate world, we don't always have the advantage of that. Part of the reason that Bill Buchanan and I have struck up a relationship is frankly that all the SOCs for most of the large banks in the UK are probably within a 5-mile square radius of this building. And that's testament to the programme and the forward thinking of Bill Buchanan and Napier, but it also means I get to spend a lot of time in Edinburgh, which is great. So for the likes of any of the big banks that have got their SOCs up here, this point about agents is actually really important, because if I can't physically get to that device, so say I'm ABC Bank and I need to get to one of my devices in Singapore, historically I would have had to have flown an investigator out to Singapore who'd go and tap somebody on the shoulder and then take away their laptop, desktop, access to server, whatever it is that they need to investigate, and that would have all happened physically. So clearly, if you're a large bank or a large manufacturer and you're heavily spread, the ability to reach out and to have the same deep forensic touch that you've had on those endpoints that are 5,000-6,000 miles away is just as important as the ones in the office. So the fact that there are so many of our agents out there actually is really, really important. Lastly, and in fact for the students here, we have a certification program, ENCE, and we encourage anyone that uses our software to go for that for the simple reason, on a personal basis, you will almost definitely never be without a job again. And we're proud to say that we've kind of educated a lot of those SOC guys that are working around here. So that's kind of our credentials. And let me kind of get straight to it. I alluded to this earlier. Our world, unlike some of the previous worlds that I've worked in, is very, very endpoint focused. And that's kind of the reason why. You know, the view is when I moved from doing data or NetSec to forensics, actually all my mates laughed at me where I worked. They said, that's crazy. This is about 3 and a bit years ago now. They all said, you're never going to make any money. Perimeter's where it all is. You know that. You've been doing it kind of 10 years. And I was like, well, I'm just a bit bored of kind of packets and payloads. I want to do something a little bit more interesting. And for me, Endpoint kind of gave me that. It was forensics, it was exciting, it was CSI. Suddenly, for once, my kids actually wanted to know what I was doing when I left the house. But for me, the real reason that I picked forensics is however I kept looking at it, all the things that cause us problems as security professionals happen on the endpoint. It's where my data is, normally. Certainly where my most valuable data is. It's where my users are, who cause me the most problems. Normally there's lots of nodding of heads at that, but I didn't say that today. But yeah, so it's where our data is. If we're if we're Rolls-Royce and we've got technical specifications for the latest engine that can't be shared with anyone, it's on an endpoint. So, we'd spent so many years kind of protecting the perimeter that endpoint is kind of back in vogue. So let's talk a bit now about some of the challenges. Age of compromise, I'm not even going to read these guys, read those out. And in fact, it's kind of already dated. I think I've had about 4 of the annual reports drop on me probably in the last 2 weeks. The 2016 Verizon data breach report is out now. It's quite interesting stuff in that. HP are talking about this cyber risk report of theirs. Data, I think, got one out as well this week. Says, for anyone who's short of reading material, now's a really good time of the year because I've probably got about 400 pages of white papers next to my desk. Long story short on this, though, we've all seen the headlines. You don't need somebody like me to say, actually, this is kind of getting really important. I met a teacher over lunch, and that was really interesting because actually her interest in being here today was teaching relatively young children, probably I'm guessing 8 through till about 12, how to be cyber aware and the fact that they can't just connect to the first bit of wireless network they see. So fundamentally our world has shifted in the last 3 or 4 years. Interesting slide. 4 years ago, we used to put this slide up and people say, we're not breached. There would be an immediate, no, can't happen to us. We spend goodness knows how many millions of dollars on our perimeter. We've got the best, fastest firewalls in the business. We've got the best web scrubbers, blah, 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 blah. The point is, if you do all of that stuff, you've got to be right every time. An attacker only has to be right once. And they've got and they keep trying. One of the highlights I did read out of one of the reports this week, something like 30% of UK businesses reckon they get hacked or attempted hacks more than once a week now. Which, if you're RBS, you probably get 20 times that volume. But these were kind of mid-sized firms, so it's kind of a worry. The other point up there, signature-based detection, not enough. And again, I can't reference the exact report, but again, one of those reports, happy to send an email to Bill later once I've read it again. One of those reports said that actually viruses are only in existence for, it was minutes before they're morphed into something else. And the reason I mention that was about the signature. So we don't dispute you need AV. Everyone's got to have AV. You need a kind of big, broad net that catches most of the stuff. But that's no good for something that's specifically written for your organisation, as probably most of you know. So you kind of need, if something happens, the reason we come into play is you need to understand what happened so that you can stop it happening next time. It's the basic principle, back to traditional forensics. So, and I'll whiz through these builds just for kind of time thing. I think anyone that's heard me speak before has actually seen these. These are out of last year's Ponemon and a few of the ones before. So really scary statistics. 60% of attacks happen in minutes or less. So that's their ingress into the network. So that's kind of fine, and a lot of us, particularly, again, given my NetSec roots, this is where that kind of prevention piece is really strong. But if stuff does get through, and it clearly does, to the next point, nearly 70% of these breaches take months or longer to find them. So for those in the room that are familiar with the Lockheed kill chain, that kind of long phase that sits right around between ingress and egress, that's actually where a lot of this stuff happens. And I will bring this back to big data later on, by the way, but that's where kind of, big data, all that stuff that you can collect, not just from your network, and your servers and your web traffic and your ISP, but actually if you start collecting data from your endpoints, you can begin to fix some of these problems. So a couple more builds on this one. Here we go, 90% of malware samples unique to an organisation. So, think about that in the context of AV. AV is based on signatures. They update 2-3 times a week, probably. How much stuff are we not seeing if that's only kind of catching 10%? 32 days to respond to an incident. You've only got to ask Dido Harding from TalkTalk about that one. It's just not acceptable. And lastly, and I always like to read this one out, so this was actually in one of those Ponemon reports. It smacks us with the fact that the bad guys seldom need days to get their job done, while the good guys rarely manage to get theirs done in a month of Sunday. So given that I am one of those good guys, actually that grates against me. I don't like the fact that that's how we're seen. So typical attack. I'm sure you guys are really familiar with this as well, so we'll just build this one out quickly. Infiltration, here's our original kind of person, that person that clicked on that phishing email, for example, here's our patient zero. Then we've got that kind of discovery phase from an attacker's point of view, where they're perhaps moving around your network, depending on who they caught, who patient zero was. This will be the time that they're spending trying to actually move from one account to another in a bid to elevate their credentials, hopefully all the way up to a sysadmin. Then they're going to capture the information that they want, whatever it might be. Then they're going to take it out. There's our opportunity in blue on the right-hand side of the screen there to kind of capture those guys, and if we don't, they're going to get away and make a heap of cash from whatever it is that they've stolen. So I don't think anyone disputes that. Depending on which vendor you see different steps, but generally that's the accepted method of an attack. And it's not just us. So this isn't based on just anecdotal advice, some skinny Londoner up for the day to talk about kind of what's great. SANS themselves, so probably like everyone in the room, we do most of our internal IT awareness stuff is done with SANS, and they say pretty much the same things that we do. Echo that with kind of what Gartner was saying about the EDR space. We've got a definite endpoint problem to fix. So, having established that we have some issues, let's kind of drill down into what our customers kind of tend to tell us that their challenges are. So first and foremost, often they're not sure if they've been breached, which is kind of quite scary. I think one of these events, I can't remember whether it was earlier this year or late last year, I had the joy of sharing the stage with a guy from the FBI. And he says that actually, you remember the guy? I can't think of his name. A lot of this guy's job was phoning up people and having the awkward conversation with the CISO that says, oh, did you know that actually one of your machines is beaconing or one of your machines is sending this out? So this stuff actually goes on. So actually, if you're the CISO, going back to that talk scenario, how would she have understood scope? So it's kind of first question. So I've already made this point. Your network, your logs, your web server logs, everything that you can kind of pull off the wire is not the same as endpoint data. And I'll make that point again. I used to be an NetSec guy. To me, if we stopped everything, and now I now know otherwise. Clearly we didn't. And actually, all that network stuff doesn't give me what an endpoint can tell me. If I need to go below the operating system on an endpoint to look in slack space on a disk to find out where something nasty has been hidden, I can't do that with my traditional kind of perimeter prevention policy. I revert back to forensics. So that was the endpoint thing. We'd already kind of touched about that. This is a really common one. And this was already touching my world when I left NetSec kind of 3 or 4 years ago. Just the sheer volume of alerts. Probably the best illustration of that, everyone's familiar with the Target breach a couple of years ago now. So Target had a very mature IT infrastructure, ITsec infrastructure. They had all the prevention stuff that we would expect to see. They had reasonably good policy and process. Unfortunately, some of their suppliers did not, and they didn't manage that very well. But the real reason that they had a big problem was that their SIM, I think, was giving 2 SOC analysts 70,000 alerts a day with no visualization, no way of prioritizing that. These guys literally used to get a report that they would come into in the morning, which was yesterday's stuff, 60,000 lines on an Excel spreadsheet. How are you going to find stuff? We're humans. You just can't do that. So alerts, alert fatigue, as some of our SOC customers kind of like to think of it, that's a problem. And then if we kind of can't see everything, then we don't know what the gaps in our policies are, kind of by default. So that's fairly straightforward. And here's another interesting one, because actually this is something that we're seeing. So people are getting better at endpoint. The banks, thankfully, have stepped up their game quite considerably in the last 2 or 3 years. Same true for health, for pharmaceuticals, important stuff, our money, our health, our treatments, schools, colleges, so on and so forth. But this point about sensitive data, and I alluded to this earlier, I mentioned Rolls-Royce. That was hypothetical, by the way. I mentioned Rolls-Royce and their latest whiz-bang tech plans for their latest engine. Now, if Rolls-Royce get breached, again, hypothetically, do they know who the custodians, sorry to use an e-discovery term, who the custodians of that intellectual property is? Because frankly, if guidance got breached tomorrow, right, and it's me that gets breached, there's nothing on my machine that's particularly sensitive. Yes, there's probably some client information, there's probably a bit of personal PII, but guidance is still going to carry on functioning perfectly well. If, however, that's our CFO, then that's an entirely different story. And one thing that we are seeing is, whilst people are now finally beginning to close the gaps on endpoints a little bit, what they're not doing is mapping. There's no sense of risk, so we're all treated the same. So actually, given back to my scenario of me versus my CFO, if my CFO gets a data breach of some form, or he leaves his laptop on a train or a plane or something, then all the alarm bells should go immediately. He might even have source code to the products that we sell, on his machine. That's a serious, serious problem for us. So what we're not seeing, and this is true everywhere, is a mapping of the data that people have access to them as individuals. And yeah, you might be able to do a little bit in AD. You might have a little Active Directory group that says, here's my C-suite. If anything happens to those, all merry hell breaks loose. But typically, with the exception of that, we're not seeing that. And that's something that kind of we think has to change. And lastly, this comes back to that alert point really, but it's the other side of it. I don't know about anyone in this room, we cannot get enough skilled people, either to be kind of directly working as part of our enterprise team like I do, or our PS people who go out and help clear up some of the messes that kind of get made. I believe it's true of Tesco Bank. I don't know if there's anyone in from there. I think it's certainly true of RBS. I think it's certainly true of Lloyd's, all of whose socks I know very well. None of them can hire people fast enough. So actually, if you've got your precious analysts who are skilled and educated and know what they're looking for, if you've got them churning through Excel spreadsheets of 60,000 logs, clearly that is not best use of their time. They're probably going to leave and go somewhere where it's a little bit more interesting, and you've still got the problem of actually getting the job done. So I think we're almost there with the challenges now. So I think we kind of laboured the point that says you can't stop these people getting in. If somebody is really, really motivated, it might take them weeks, months or years, but if you've got something they want, they can get in and get it. They will find a way. Whether it's like Target through their supply chain, whether it's for an individual phishing, so on and so forth. And this is kind of where we begin to see the big data stuff come into play a little bit. So, endpoint visibility. This is kind of first and foremost. I talked about those agents that, if I want to investigate somebody in Singapore, that's kind of my mechanism for doing so. Effectively means that I can look at that machine in the same way that I could look at it if it were on the desk next to me. There's a whole kind of bunch of other stuff there. For those of you that kind of recognise you have something to do in this space, then probably that top point would be the one thing that I would argue that you would need to kind of consider most. A lot of the stuff that we see that's good for endpoints is Windows only, which is kind of okay because that's the bulk of our endpoints. So better to do that than nothing at all. But actually, do I just want to know what's going on my Windows desktops? Yeah, I want to know that, but what I really want to know is what's going on my Linux server estate, because actually that's where my real valuable stuff is. People shouldn't be able to save stuff because of how we're configured to a local drive. We send them to a UNC share. That's the stuff that's where my valuable stuff is. Kind of touched upon that second point as well. If you can't see below the OS, then actually in the malware world, that can be quite a challenge, because some of the malware now is really sophisticated. There's memory-only stuff that never even writes itself to disk, and there's a whole plethora of other stuff that you have to look deep, deep, deep inside the machine to find out that it's even been there. The rest of those, you can read those. To highlight the deep point, so if we think about that top row across the top there, the one with the boat, so it's meant to illustrate that this was on the surface. Think of this as perhaps stuff that my AV might find on my machine, for example. So it's stuff that's relatively near the surface. We don't have to delve particularly deep. We don't need specialist skills. We don't need an ENCE trained investigator to go and forensically examine this machine or take an image and go and do what he's going to do or she's going to do. But as you can see, as we move down and we start getting into the more complex stuff, like actually we're going to start looking at link files. We can't find any other residue that this particular piece of malware has left. But there will be something in the link files. There's probably something in the app cache. There's places where you can go to actually give you that information. So deep visibility is kind of the point there. And the reason that that's important, and to bring this back to big data, a slide that some of you might have seen before from us, endpoints have, and I think this is half the challenge that, NetSec, if I kind of think back through my career, NetSec actually is kind of quite straightforward to look at and fix, because networks, by the whole kind of point, the whole principle of them is you've got these kind of connection points, you've got bottlenecks. So if you've got bottlenecks on something, then actually you can look at what goes through, and that's great. But of course, an endpoint, my machine there probably has a completely different, if I'd hashed that this morning, if I'd done a complete file set hash on my whole system, just in me mucking about doing bits and pieces on the way up here would have already changed from that hash set. And I think part of the challenge that why endpoints historically have kind of been left to last, everyone's kind of done this and they've built their citadels and they're kind of not worried about what's inside. And I think part of that is just the sheer amount of change that happens to an endpoint and the sheer amounts of data that endpoints can generate. And that kind of in our world hasn't really helped us kind of fix problems. So if I can actually look at my endpoints in the detail that the previous slides have just described, as I said, all the way from memory right down to physical access to disk. If I can see all of that, and actually now, unlike 4 or 5 years ago, I have sophisticated data mining capabilities, whether it's with a Splunk that I'm using for data aggregation or Tableau software like a lot of the banks use for visualization of data. I can actually begin to do stuff with some of this endpoint data now, which is actually good. And that kind of brings us to some of the thinking about the fix for these challenges. And I kind of alluded to this earlier, back to my kind of circle round my estate, inside out framework. So it's actually kind of stop looking at your endpoints as a bit of a pain. It's where the users are, it's where the data is, but I've got 40,000 of the things to try and manage. It's a challenge. But actually, if you start kind of thinking about how can I use those endpoints, and it was at one of these functions, in fact, there was a threat intel guy speaking, whose name escapes me, from RBS. And he said something that was really quite profound. He said that RBS consider each one of their endpoints, so what historically has kind of been left alone, as a sensor. So when they're actually considering what's being thrown at the bank day in, day out, actually they'll poll the endpoint estate and see, okay, so my malware sandbox saw this particular nasty hash go over the network, destined for subnet range, blah, 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 blah. So actually, if you've got a way of looking at your endpoints, you can begin to pull that information together. Did that malware actually land on that subnet? No. Oh, great. I can ignore that alert, move on. Oh, it did. Okay, what are we going to do? Well, let's have a quick poll of current state of those machines. Let's see what's actually kind of going on. And these are things that were difficult to do previously. So inside out security framework, vendor agnostic. There's a few of us signed up to this. You can see the bit there. It's almost like a kind of cut down kill chain. Know yourself, be able to detect stuff, be able to respond to it when you find it, and be able to fix it when all's good. So the first phase of that, detect and assess. So again, coming back to big data, if I mentioned RBS there, 150,000 users. So we could probably assume that a fair proportion of those have got access to more than one device. They might have 200,000 nodes that they're trying to think about. And given that we're probably going to pull from our endpoints, we're going to pull ARP table, processes running in memory, a whole list of criteria, maybe 15, 20 sets of criteria. Multiply that by, 200,000. It's a lot of stuff. So this is where it's very much in the detect phase, where the ability to manipulate vast amounts of data quickly and to be able to give you something that essentially gives you a priority list is really, really powerful. Again, I'm not going to kind of read off all of those slides. So as we move from detect and assess, we'll kind of start looking at assess and respond. And this is about being proactive. And part of the challenge about being an end-case guy is historically we didn't do anything. We're not known for being a proactive. We're the people that you call when you can't call anybody else. When all your other avenues have gone, then we're normally the people you call. So we're very much in the incident response space as opposed to being proactive. That said, with the capabilities of our agents, and this is true for other vendors and their agents in the same space, once you've got that capability to understand what your endpoints are doing, then actually you can begin to go proactive threat hunting. So, okay, somebody attacked a particular device with this type of thing. Is it anywhere else on our network? Have I got an MD5 hash for it? Have I got a name for it? However I'm going to search for it. And equally it could be, we talked about this earlier when we were talking about Rolls-Royce and their intellectual property. And you remember I was saying actually most organisations haven't mapped the data risk that they have with their people. So actually using polling out and finding where that data is a really good kind of first stance. Oh, okay, we know that document should only be in engineering, but hey, we found a version of it in sales. Let's get rid of that version in sales and let's make sure that doesn't happen again. So assess and respond. Response automation. So this is an interesting one. It's an interesting one because just about every SOC analyst I know would say, well, no, I don't want to automate any remediation, and they're right. You don't want to have Skype accidentally fall into your blacklist one night and then automatically remediate it off everyone's machine by 9 o'clock the next morning. Actually, Skype probably wouldn't be a problem. If that were email, if that were Exchange or whatever people use, then actually that would be a problem. That said, we made the point about the fact that there aren't enough, none of us can get enough skilled analysts, and actually our analyst time is valuable. Rather than having them go through our 60,000 page spreadsheet, let's try and make it easy for our analysts to actually kind of do their job. So if, for example, one of my endpoints is attacked at 2 a.m. on a Friday night, in the UK, my help desk people went home at 7. Then potentially I've got until Monday morning before anyone gets a look at that particular alert. So one of the things, a good example of automation is actually if you get an alert generated by your SIM, reach out to the endpoint, take current state at that time. That's a really good thing to happen automatically. It means that when my analyst gets in on Monday morning, then actually, we had this nasty alert. Oh, okay, there was the endpoint state at the time. Here's endpoint state currently. Oh, well, good job actually we had that earlier current state, because actually I can do something about it, because actually that's all a little bit degraded now by Monday morning. So automation of tasks within the SOC actually can be really important. Just kind of depends how far you want to take it. So automated incident response, we've touched upon that. And on demand as well, so this is kind of a nice one. And we've got a bit up there about whitelists and blacklists. So for example, one of the current states that we could look at, we could say, compare Rainsburgh's machine to how it looked at 9 a.m. this morning. Or compare it to his gold build. And actually anything that's not part of that gold build, yes, do an auto remediate on it. Save my analyst time. Don't send an analyst to Ian to do that. There's a bit down there, I mentioned this earlier, about integration with existing technologies. We see this as kind of really, really important, and I will touch upon that on an almost coding slide. So remediate, we've touched upon this. Kill running process. In fact, it's a really, if we can't remediate forensically, And by that I mean kind of, it once got described to me as sniper-based forensics. And a really good example of that is, again, banking. Banking have lots of machines that cannot be switched off. End of story. Often transaction processing machines. And they literally, they might have 5 minutes factored downtime a year, hot standbys and all the rest of it. So currently, what would happen is if one of those machines gets a problem, so it's a DNS server, one of those machines gets a problem, then actually my choices are take the machine offline, wipe and re-image it, change control issues, might take me 2 days, but in 2 days, given what that box normally does, I might lose as a bank, or in fact I probably know how much I'm going to lose, might be X amount, 100,000, millions, blah, 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 whatever it is. So the IT sec will need to go to the risk manager and say, we've got this problem on this machine. And the risk manager is going to say, well, how much is it going to cost us to turn it off? That much. Actually, we'll keep running because the risk sits on my risk. It costs me more to turn it off than to take the chance. So in those scenarios, the ability to actually find that rogue process, to look at where that rogue process is written to disk and eradicate any any trace of it without actually turning the box off is really, really powerful. So I mentioned a closing slide about infrastructure. I appreciate it's quite a busy slide and you probably need to be as close as I am to it to actually see it. But the point in here is that actually we've made investment over the years in our antivirus technology. We've made investment in our firewalls, in our web application firewalls. We need all of that stuff still. Every large corporation we speak to, the current mantra from the board is defence in depth. And most organisations have got a lot of this kind of networky infrastructure really down pat. But what a lot of people are missing is still that endpoint piece in the middle. So that's almost my last slide. One summary slide. I love that second point. If you can't see your endpoints, if you cannot see your estate, if you can only see your perimeter, then you can't be secure, because you can't secure what you can't see. It's kind of, to us, it's kind of fairly black and white. It's me done.
Thank you very much indeed. So I'm going to try and pull people back to time. One question, perhaps? Okay, one at the back.
We've seen a situation where security software can itself be subverted.
Yes, yeah, we have. So I can only speak for us. I kind of don't know what every other vendor does. There was a very well publicised one actually for some endpoint people, I think an AV company a few years ago, who essentially, in doing its updates, essentially installed malware across its whole user base. So personally what we do, so we have, funny enough, we use our own tools to do it. So we have to certify our source code. And typically if we're responding to a large bid, for example, for a big bank or a big manufacturer, a big drug firm, anyone of scale, then actually as part of that process, we normally have to certify that our software is not going to introduce anything nasty to their environment. So it's kind of two stages to it. There's the due diligence that we do behind the scenes to make sure our own house is clean. And then there's the confidence of actually certifying that, as we have to for many of these large organisations.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you.